class, this is Dr. McGonigal with another Research Methods 2 lecture for you. Today we are going to talk about the methods section. The methods section contains information that the reader needs in order to understand what you did in your study. So by reading your methods section, the reader should be able to completely replicate your study if they wanted to. In the methods section, you want to use subsections and proper use of APA-style subheadings. First, you have your participants section. This is the number of participants in your sample. It includes demographic information on your sample, such as descriptive statistics on gender, age, student status, ethnicity, etc. So these are descriptive statistics on different demographics in your particular sample. Also, you want to include any inclusion or exclusion criteria for your specific study and any other information you can provide about who participated in your study. The second piece is the procedure. This includes the recruitment methods, the enrollment methods, so how participants came to be in your study. The method of data collection, for instance, was it an online survey? Was it an experimental study? Was it a lab setting? Was it a field setting? Did you run an experiment online? You also want to include a measures section, and this describes all of the measures used for your specific study, including sample items, response scales, coefficient alphas, and citations to the authors of the scale, where you got the scale from. So let's talk about each of these in turn. And before we do, I'll just make a comment that if your participants and procedure sections are fairly brief, you can combine them into one section that's titled Participants and Procedure. This is pretty common in studies. So let's talk more about the participants subsection. So this is your first subsection. This includes who are your participants and how many. In other words, you want to type the letter N, uppercase N, italicized, equals, and then put the number of participants in your study in there. It also includes information on your study response rate if you have it. So not all studies will be able to report a response rate, but if you can, you would report that. And this is based on the number of potential participants that you reached out to and the number who actually participated in your study. For example, you could say 200 individuals were emailed a link to an online survey and 100 completed the survey, resulting in a response rate of 50%. You also want to include how the participants were selected to be in your study. Where were they recruited from? For instance, did they come from a specific organization? Did they come from a school? Were advertisements posted in any specific locations? Were there any inclusion or exclusion criteria? So what does that mean? In other words, did they have to have certain characteristics or not have certain characteristics in order to be eligible to participate? So for your paper too, where can you find this information? Where do you think? Well, if you said the code book, you would be correct. So you can find the information that you need, some of it for your participant subsection, in your code book. The next piece of information that you want to include are the demographics, the demographic characteristics. So, for instance, the average age, the number of women in your sample, and so forth and so on. So in other words, present descriptive statistics for your demographic variables here. We went over that in our last lecture, so if you're confused about what I mean, make sure that you watch the videos that I posted on descriptive statistics, and before that on data cleaning and SPSS. For instance, the average age of participants was 37.48, standard deviation, SD equals 8.67. Half the sample, 50%, identified as male, and 80% were working full-time. The procedure subsection, and again, you can combine this with your participant subsection if you would like. This includes recruitment and enrollment. So how were participants recruited for the study and how did they enroll in the study? For example, did they sign an informed consent form? Did they have to have an interview with the study coordinator to determine whether they were eligible? Did they complete an online eligibility check? In terms of study participation, then you want to talk about, did they participate, for instance, in an experiment? If so, what was the experimental manipulation? What did they do as part of that experiment? Did they come to a lab setting, or was the study online or in some other setting like a school or a workplace? If the study used surveys, were those surveys administered online or with a paper and pencil? If they were paper and pencil surveys, how did participants return them? Was it a locked box, for instance? Did they hand them to the researcher? Did they mail them, for instance, via the U.S. Postal Service? How long did it take participants to participate in your study? Were there multiple sessions involved in your study? If so, how many? Was there an incentive given for participation? If so, how much was that incentive, and how were those incentives distributed? The next major subsection is your measures, and this is where you describe all of the measures that were used in your study. For instance, in a survey study, describe what measures were used. Important information to include is how many items were in each measure, a citation with a corresponding reference in your references section. So in other words, put the citation for the article where you got the measure from. You want to provide a sample item for each measure. You want to provide the instructions that participants received, if any, and provide one example survey question verbatim in quotes. So remember that every time you are using a verbatim wording from an article, you need to put that in quotes. So you want to put your question, your example survey question that participants took, in the quotes. Describe your scoring, including the lowest and highest scores and what they indicate. For example, scores were measured on a scale ranging from 1, strongly disagree, to 5, strongly agree. Higher scores indicated greater levels of self-esteem. So talk about what the low point means and what the high point means. It's not always going to be strongly disagree is 1 and strongly agree is 5, but make sure whatever that response scale is that you accurately describe it and tell us what those high and low points mean. Finally, you want to report your coefficient alpha for each measure. For example, coefficient alpha for the self-esteem measure, calculated using the current sample, was 0.84. Here's an example of a method section on this slide and the following slide. I want to note that this is just an example, and you do not need to have all of these particular things in your method section. Why? This is a different study than yours. So this is not the same study that you are currently working on for your paper 2. But this is meant to be an example so you can see what it would look like in another study. You can see here that for this study, I have combined the participants and procedure sections into one section labeled participants and procedure. You can see that I start by explaining how many participants there were, where they came from, the different work units involved, and then I get into demographics. I say that the sample had 63% reported female and an average age of 37.3 years. You can see the means and the standard deviations are reported. And then I get into more specifics on the procedure involved. So you can see that I have information on a response rate. I have information on the incentive provided, a $10 gift card. The next part is the measures, and you can see that the measures section is broken into subsections for each of the measures, and you should do this as well in your paper 2. So in this particular sample, I have 3 measures. One is injuries, another is management commitment to safety, and the third is teamwork. So for each of those variables, I am talking very specifically about how those variables were measured. Let's use the example of management commitment to safety. So you'll see there that I provided the number of items, a 3-item scale. I provided the reference, SORA and NEVA in 2004. I provided the coefficient alpha, which was 0.73. I provided a sample item, which is unit management provides a work climate that promotes workplace safety. I provided the response scale, which ranged from 1, strongly disagree, to 5, strongly agree. And I stated that higher scores indicated greater levels of management commitment to safety. And remember that that's very important. You always want your variables to have higher scores indicating more of something.